Hi, folks. This is Jeff Morrison from the Cadmus Group. You are listening to the webinar on electric vehicle corridor planning in the Western United States. I'm going to kick off the slideshow here just with a couple slides and then hand it over to Diane Turchetta. So we'll go ahead and get started, and I'll go over how to do questions in just a second. So our agenda here today, Diane Turchetta is going to kick us off, talk about the National Alternative Fuels Corridor Initiative. We're going to hear from Tonya Buell of Washington State DOT. We'll hear from Zach Owens of the Colorado Energy Office and his colleague Maria Eisman. Then we'll hear from James Campbell from PacifiCorp. And then I'll talk briefly about a new website that was just launched on Friday called altfueltoolkit.org. So please feel free to submit questions in the chat box during the webinar. We're not going to take questions until everyone's talked, but I'll be kind of, taking all the questions and keeping track of them, and then we'll just go through them at the end. So we have an hour and a half for this webinar, and I'm really excited about it. I think we've got kind of the premier experts who know what's going on the ground in the Western United States. Just real quick, the registrants, we actually have over 240 now. As of this morning, and it's kind of a mix of industry, government, and nonprofit. Just real quick about my company, Cadmus Group. We do a range of transportation services. We support the Federal Highway Administration in a lot of their alternative fuels initiatives. And on this specific project, we're also been helped a lot by Vermont Energy Investment Corporation, VEIC, and Atlas Public Policy. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Diane Turchetta, who I think needs to unmute herself.
Yes, I am unmuted.
All right. Great. Diane, take it away.
Thanks, Jeff, and thanks to everyone for tuning in today to today's webinar. I'm going to just provide some context up front and go over Federal Highway's Alternative Fuel Corridor Program. Let me just jump right into it here. Jeff, you can go to the next slide. Thanks. So there was a provision in the last Transportation Reauthorization Bill, the FAST Act, for the Secretary of Transportation to designate alternative fuel corridors. And specific guidance was given in terms of what fuels they would be, being electric vehicle charging, hydrogen, propane, and natural gas, which includes compressed natural gas and liquefied natural gas. So some of the other specifics of the provision, Congress directed us to look at near and long-term need for infrastructure and look at strategic locations along major national highways. The solicitations for the designations were to come from state and local officials. We were to take a look and incorporate existing infrastructure, demand and location, and of course include any stakeholder involvement that we could, and everything of course was on a voluntary basis. There were no mandates in this provision and no funding was authorized. So let's go to the next slide and we'll take a look at the initial designations which were made in November 2016. We received 34 nomination packages that nominated portions or full corridors, segments of corridors across the country. And we divided them into two categories, a signage ready and a signage pending. And there's a little different terminology we may be using this year. We may be calling them corridor complete or corridor pending. So just wanted to alert you to that little change in terminology. But basically the signage complete or corridor complete information was just corridors that had sufficient facilities on them to warrant highway signage. And we'll talk a little bit about signage in a minute. And then the other half of this was nominations that weren't quite ready, didn't have the facilities on the corridors yet, had some gaps to be filled in, so we put those in a signage or corridor pending bucket. So in the end, the designations included portions or segments of 55 interstates and a few large state roads and highways that were nominated, comprised 36 states plus the District of Columbia, and covered about 85,000 miles of the national highway system. So as it said, the initial phase, and as we continue to focus on interstates, we did ask for any state roads or routes that basically you all, from a nomination perspective, could make a case for in terms of if it was a major freight throughway, or you had another specific region or another specific reason to nominate something other than an interstate. So, but we were focusing both on the initial round and the second round on building out the infrastructure on the interstates. And of course, all the decisions we made were in coordination with the Alternative Fuel Station Locator at the National Renewable Energy Lab. We work closely with them, and we'll talk a little bit more about that working relationship in a minute. So I see Jeff went to the next slide there. We had to develop criteria for each fuel in terms of putting those nominations into a signage ready or signage pending bucket. What you see on this screen is the criteria we came up with. And you see a red circle around hydrogen and under EV. I know we're only talking electric vehicles on this webinar. So we'll start there. You see the 50 miles between stations, the 5 miles from the highway and public stations only, and we did not include Tesla facilities the first time around or the second time around. But the first time we looked at level 2, included level 2 facilities in our corridor nominations or designations. This time around, we only looked at DC fast charging. Reason being, we're looking at corridors. It doesn't really make sense to look at level 2 chargings that take hours and hours if you were to pull off the road to charge. So we just looked at DC fast charging. And just to mention the hydrogen, the difference in the hydrogen this time around is we included non-road facilities for hydrogen stations, but that if we did include a non-road facility, still had to meet light-duty hydrogen vehicle standards, fueling standards, and all the other requirements that are listed under hydrogen. So what I did on this next slide is basically just, I know it's a little small, but give you a snapshot of the EV corridors from the first round. So this is just from the 2016 maps. So the small clusters of blue dots are the EV facilities around the country. The orange lines are electric vehicle pending corridors. And if you could see the green lines, you can see them best on I-5 in the West Coast and I-95 in the East Coast are the signage-ready EV corridors. So in the next slide, I tried to pull out a little bit of the more detail in the western states. This is what the map looked like for the EV corridors in the western states, and some of you probably already know or are familiar with this, but we have a little bit of I-15 there in Idaho and Colorado. These are signage-ready. I-76, I-25, I-70, portions of those interstates in Utah, a little bit of I-15 and I-80 in Nevada, Vegas to California border on I-15. A lot of pending corridors you see there across Nevada, so we're hoping at some point to fill all of that in. So on to the 2017 request for nominations. We went out in September 2017 with a request for nominations. Last year, the initial year, 2016, we went out with a Federal Register notice. Just to simplify things this year, we went out through our Federal Highway Division offices with the request for nominations, and it provided the ability to nominate new corridors or add fuel types to the existing corridors. And we had a due date on that of November 30th, 2017. So we learned a lot the first round of this process. So we made a few changes on the latest call for designations. Once again, of course, as the provision said, it could be submitted from any state or local official. The focus again was on interstate highways. but we also allowed for, as I said before, some major state roads and routes with, reasoning behind it. The state DOT did not have to be the nominating official, but we always remind folks, whether it's a state energy office, environmental office, or another entity, that always good to check with your state DOT and have their support since they have jurisdiction over their corridor. We encourage multi-state and regional applications, but it was perfectly fine if a state wanted to submit just for themselves. And we also asked for a plan for signage this year. One of the things we found is that people were so focused on the facilities that, hadn't really thought about, especially for the off the bat, the signage ready corridors, how they were going to put signage out there, and coordinated with the state DOT on that. We also asked for GIS shape files this year, which we didn't last year, which just helps us get up and running with the information. So on to the next slide there. Thanks, Jeff. One of the questions that came up in the initial round of nominations, what really makes a corridor? So we tried to define that a little bit. The corridor should have 2 to 3 stations and be at least 150 miles in length, or the entire length of the corridor in a state if it's less than that. But we're really going to use some common sense here, and all the designations will be made on a case-by-case basis. The pending corridors, one thing we found in the initial designations that some folks nominated pending corridors but really had no good plan or strategic plan or idea of how they were going to get facilities out there. So what we were asking for this time around was a little thought behind, if you are nominated in pending corridor, will there be facilities there? What's the plan? How are you going to get those facilities there? Just so people are thinking about that. And we also encourage folks to coordinate with Electrify America. I'm sure you all are aware of the Electrify America effort and the infrastructure they have announced that they're putting out on the interstates, and they also had a list of priority or targeted interstates, so it just made sense to coordinate with them. And also always encourage public-private coordination and include your Clean Cities coordinators. I would have to say some of the best applications we got, both in the first year and the second round, were ones that the Clean Cities, DOE's Clean Cities coordinators were involved in. And another thought to keep in the back of your mind, this is not a requirement at all, but always good if you're looking at alternative fuel corridors to coordinate that with your state freight plans or your long-range transportation plans. So on a little bit to signage here, as we were rolling out the program, we had our colleagues here in our Federal Highway Office of Operations develop a signage memo according to the Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices, which was issued in December 2016, and you'll find that memo on the website. So what it did is provide guidance to state DOTs on the use and location of the alternative fuel corridor sign. And we'll see in a minute pictures, but the first signs installed on I-94 in Minnesota and I-26 in South Carolina. And there are still questions regarding, the use of signs and the difference between general service and specific service exit signs. And, as we get those questions, we have a frequently asked question document on our website, and we'll add to that as these questions come in, but we try to clarify all the signage questions through that document, but there's always one more question we need to add to it. So the next page basically gives you a visual of what the signs look like there on I-26 in South Carolina and I-94 in Minnesota. And one thing I want to point out here, the smaller signs underneath the bigger alternative fuels corridor signs are the general service signs. And those are all over already. They're all over the country. I pass a lot of them in the DC metro area and in Maryland, Virginia. What the MUTCD memo is really, the policy of that location and the usage is really for the bigger alternative fuels corridor sign and how they are used with the general service signs. So you really have to read through it to take a look at the specifics of that. So some preliminary information from the last round of nominations. We received 24 nominations. This time from mostly from state DOTs. The initial round were mostly from state energy and state environmental agencies. We had a couple of those this time, some MPOs in the governor's office and one economic development authority. You see there, I'm not going to go through all the states, but we had 14 new lead applicants and 10 repeat states and 8 completely new states. So counting last year's designations and what we're assuming will be at least some pending and signage ready corridors from this round of designations, we're looking at 44 states plus the District of Columbia that will at least have a pending or signage corridor. So the next steps, what we're in the middle of now is analyzing those nominations with my colleagues from Volpe. And as I mentioned before, we have an interagency agreement in place with the National Renewable Energy Lab, who are folks out there, the GIS folks are working away, and we're overlaying a lot of the information, shapefiles we got with the AFDC database. And we should have the selections announced probably early to mid-February next month. And every year we hold some meetings with industry groups and some key stakeholders here in DC, just to, you know, get their feedback on the process and really see if they would like us to change the process for next year, or just to get a little bit of feedback on how we did and how things can go better. We also will be kicking off 4 or 5 regional or local, I call them convenings. I think they're really a combination of workshops or peer exchanges. We're calling them regional alternative fuel corridor workshops or peer exchanges, convenings, whatever you'd like to call them. We're just at the beginning stages of that. We don't have a timeline yet or location, so stay tuned for that and keep looking at the website, and we'll get messages out to you about where and when they will be. We continue to work with groups across the country. There are corridor coalitions that were in existence before we started this, and ones that have actually popped up since we started it. Of course, we'd love to work with you all in the Western and Mountain States on your the implementation of your MOU and see where we can coordinate with the corridor program. We're working with Florida and Indiana, and of course, there are 6 states left that have no corridors as of yet, and we'd really like to get them on board. So I'm going to leave you with the last slide of some contact information. Myself and Mike Scarpino and Stephen Costa from the Volpe Center, who are my colleagues working on me with the program. There you have the Alternative Fuel Corridor website, the MUTCD memorandum on signage that I talked about, and of course DOE's NREL's alternative fueling station locator. So I guess we will go on from here and wait for questions.
Great, thanks, Diane. So this is Jeff Morrison again from the Cadmus Group. I'm the moderator, and for those of you who joined late, please feel free to enter questions in the chat box. We'll be taking those at the very end. And I also wanted to say that this webinar is being recorded, and the slides and the recording will be posted onto a website, altfueltoolkit.org. You'll see it again here in my slides, but it's altfueltoolkit.org, and it'll be a couple days from now, it'll be posted. So without further ado, we'll go to Tonya Buell of Washington State DOT, who's going to talk to us about the West Coast Electric Highway. Tonya.
Good morning, good afternoon. It's my pleasure to be here. Again, my name is Tonya Buell, and I'm with the Washington State Department of Transportation. And I've been working on electric vehicles since the concept of charging along highway corridors, and actually helped with managing one of the first corridors in the nation. Next. So Diane gave you a great overview of the highway designations, and we're really pleased on the West Coast to have one of the longest, most robust EV charging corridors in the nation. It spans 1,350 miles, and we were designated in the first round. Next. along with having a strong infrastructure, we also have a lot of car sales and high market share in the West Coast states. Next. So today I'm going to talk to you about the West Coast Electric Highway, give you an overview, talk about the importance of working with folks like Diane Turchetta and Jeff with CADMIS and working with other states and partners. And then I know a lot of you are either starting to work on highway corridor charging or thinking about it. So I'm going to give you some of my input on things that I think you should be aware of as you're planning. Next. So first, I wanted to say one of the reasons we've been so successful is because our leaders in our West Coast states and the province have been working together for several years. Our governors of Washington, Oregon, and California, and the Premier of BC formed the Pacific Coast Collaborative in 2008, and the goal was to work together on energy, climate, and transportation. And the Pacific Coast Collaborative actually represents the world's 5th largest economy, and the region has 55 million people. Next. One of our goals through the Pacific Coast Collaborative is to work on promoting alternative fuels, providing alternative fuel infrastructure along Interstate 5 and Highway 99 going up and down the coast from BC to BC, which is British Columbia, Canada, to Baja, California, Mexico. And actually, that picture there is from my very first day on the job when the Hydrogen Highway group of people drove hydrogen-fueled vehicles from BC to BC and made some stops along the way. And that work with the Hydrogen Highway really influenced my work on the West Coast Electric Highway, promoting alternative fuels. I realized that you really need to have fueling along the way. Next. So our goal with the West Coast Electric Highway is to have a robust charging corridor, give EV drivers the ability to travel longer distances. The focus really is on the EV driver. We've worked together among our states and the province to come up with equipment specifications that were consistent, highway signage, branding and marketing. That symbol that you saw, the electric highway alternative symbol that was in Diane's presentation, is something that's actually started in the Pacific Northwest. Actually, Art James in Oregon really pushed that through, and we all agreed to use it among our states. Our goal really is for EV drivers to have a seamless experience. So whether they're crossing the state line or the country's border, they're going to recognize and feel comfortable knowing that this is all part of the network. Next. So this is the original West Coast Electric Highway that opened in 2012. We actually had our groundbreaking in 2011 in Bellingham, the farthest north city. And at that time, there was no combo charging system. The only fast charger that was available was the CHAdeMO charger for the 50 kilowatt DC fast charger. And actually, we had to wait for some of these to get UL listed. The original locations were made possible from federal funding, and it was a variety of funding options. One was through U.S. Department of Energy, provided funds through our state energy program, and then in Oregon, they were able to secure Tiger funding. And we had a lot of partners, WashDOT and Washington State DOT and Oregon DOT worked closely with AeroVironment. We had 22 different utilities along this route and 57 host sites, and worked with the EV drivers to get this started. So we've learned a lot since 2011 when we started this, and things are constantly changing and growing and getting better. And so this was the basis, and we're continuing to fill in gaps and expand. Next. I wanted to show you a picture of what some of these locations look like. We have charging on city property, grocery stores, restaurants, hotels, fueling stations, and shopping malls. These are some examples along our Interstate 5 corridor. Next. We've also expanded from the north-south I-5 corridor to go east-west out to some of our popular tourist locations like wineries and ski resorts. Next. Okay, I'm going to give you my top 10 things to think about while you're planning your charging corridor. First, you want to know what your plan is, what your purpose is, how you're going to measure it. Second, you're going to collaborate with your partners. Third, you're going to work closely with your electric utilities. Four, that's a big investment. You want to make sure you're picking the right site. You want to, fifth, account for weather and terrain issues. Six, you want to make sure people know about your charging network, so you're going to promote it. You also want to do what you can to encourage electric vehicle sales through things like incentives on the purchase of vehicles, cash on the hood. And along with collaborating with partners, you want to develop public-private partnerships, which is number 8. Number 9, consistent signage. And number 10, things are changing, get ready for the future. So I'm going to go through each of these in a little more detail, and I'll be happy to answer questions at the end of the webinar. So first off, we want to always have the electric vehicle driver in mind when you are planning your network. You want to make it easy, convenient, and definitely make sure the equipment's working and it's reliable. When you're developing your corridor, you want to definitely have your deployment plan. You want to have at least one metro area anchoring your corridor and pick cities and communities along the route. And you can start with a 200-mile corridor and put in a couple fast chargers. That's a great way to get started, and you can expand from there. And originally, when we were planning the West Coast Electric Highway, we were looking at safety rest areas, but we found that the most streamlined way to make this happen is to actually work at retail centers where near highway interchanges, where the 3-phase power already exists. And then you want to have some duplication. Next. This is just a sampling of some of the partners that we've been working with. You've got to work with your federal folks like Diane. You want to work with your different states that are part of the corridor, like we have on the West Coast. You also want to work with your cities along the way. They're very important partners. And there are so many partners. The key is to make sure that the right players are at the table. Next. Your number one partner is your electric utility. They can make or break your corridor charging. So once you have identified the corridor that you want to work on and targeted some communities along the way, then you're going to want to get your utility, electric power utility, to come out and help identify specific target locations where you can find transformer, where there's enough power. And so work with your electric utilities. They are the ones that get the call when someone buys an electric vehicle and wants to know, okay, now how do I charge this thing? What do I do? So make them partners early on. Next. Okay, so our sites that we've kind of come up with this general site criteria that we work with in Washington, Oregon, California, and British Columbia. That one, yes. And the bottom line is you want to find a location where you have the power that you need, where EV drivers are going to have what they need, such as restrooms, drinking water, something to do, place to shop. And one of the things that we learned early on is that you want to make sure your location has 24/7 access. You don't want it to be in a parking garage that closes at midnight and opens again at 6 a.m. You want 24/7 access, because when you're an EV driver and you need a charge, you need it then. We're actually working with University of Washington to help us identify key locations for investing in EV charging through using lots of data, including where people are coming and going, origin, destination information, traffic information, and putting together a model for that. And Idaho National Labs has also been a great partner over the years with reviewing and analyzing the charging data. And then the hardest part of EV charging corridors is working with the specific site. It can take months and months, especially if you're working with a company that has corporate headquarters in another state. So I recommend, if you can, to try and work with a regional store chain where you can come up with one agreement that you can use in several locations. This really is the hardest part, is getting the leases negotiated, getting the easements and permits, and the actual installation isn't that hard. It's the site host where you've got to spend your most time and attention. And so don't get discouraged. It can take months. And then when you find the actual location, put it near a transformer, because once you start trenching and cutting concrete, the cost can just skyrocket. Next. So you can see in the picture, at least the one on the right, that you have to prepare for all kinds of weather conditions. And we had one location where, although we had an agreement for snow plowing, didn't always happen, and we'd get major snowstorms and EV drivers wouldn't be able to charge up. And in this particular location, it's cute with the kids playing. Their parents had to dig out the charger. But to actually do any repairs or maintenance on the charger, at least the AeroVironment ones, you have to have about 6 feet available behind the station as well. So make sure that you've got snow removal in place. AeroVironment got creative in Oregon at one of the locations where they actually had radiant heat on the platform, so it melted the snow away around the charger. So that's something to think about. And then we have another place called the Richfield Rookery, which there's a charger under a tree that the birds love, so it can get kind of messy. Next. Promotion is really important. The whole goal of having a charging corridor is to give people peace of mind that they can find charging where they need it. And this is a time to engage your partners that you've worked with along the way. You can have groundbreakings, ribbon cuttings, and I especially think electric road rallies are effective, where you're actually having a bunch of drivers going from location to location, because that shows that you can get from point A to point B. And we actually had a big celebration at the Peace Arch State Park, where we had drivers that, there were 9 electric vehicle drivers that drove from the Canadian border down to San Diego. And so we had a big kickoff for that. And that was very effective. Next. Like I mentioned before, you want to make sure that you are selling the cars. So people are charging up at your stations. It makes for a better business model if there are people with cars actually going out and charging them up. Next. And Diane already talked a little bit about signage. We actually have a state law requiring on-site signage. And one of the key things with your roadway signage, if you work with your Department of Transportation to put highway signs up, you want to make sure that when someone exits, because they see there's charging, that there's wayfinder signs that will get you from the highway exit to wherever the charging is. So work with your cities and counties on the local roads to make sure you're signed to get people there. And although people that drive electric vehicles have all the information they need in their apps and in their car, it's good advertising for potential EV drivers. Next. The next area that we're working on in Washington is expanding our network of highway charging, and we're able to take a portion of EV registration funds, pull them together. We just awarded $1 million worth of grants, working with public and private sector partners to put in 15 additional locations to fill in gaps and reach new areas that don't have any charging. So we're really excited about that. Next. And think about the future. Things are constantly changing. They say that DC fast charging, the 50 kilowatt, is going to be the new level 2 soon. For example, with Verde Future, their FF91, for it to charge on a 50 kilowatt charger, it's going to take 112 minutes. And so that's not really a fast charger. So think about the faster charging, and just be ready to grow and change as needed. Next. Hope that my top 10 was helpful, and thank you again for having me here today.
Great, thanks so much, Tonya. That was excellent. Our next presenter is Zach Owens from Colorado Energy Office, and really appreciate all the panelists being online here with us. Just wanted to repeat that if you have questions, please use the chat box. We'll get to the questions at the very end. And also the slides and the audio recording will be posted onto altfueltoolkit.org. And I'll type that into the chat box right now so you guys have that link. Okay, Zach, take us away.
Yes, thanks. Actually, this is Maria. I'm going to start out. I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to speak with you all today. And thanks to Tonya. We're going to talk more about the process we're undergoing now, because we're not at a point to share many lessons learned, but we're going to share with you the process for what we're doing with transportation corridors here in the West. My name is Maria Eisman. I am the Transportation Policy Analyst for the Colorado Energy Office. I'm going to speak to you about the Regional Electric Vehicle Plan for the West, also called REV West, and our Colorado Electric Vehicle Plan. My colleague, actually you can switch to the next slide. My colleague, Zach Owens, he's the Transportation Program Manager for the Colorado Energy Office, is going to speak to you about a request for application for EV fast charging corridors in Colorado that our office will be releasing soon. Next slide. In 2016, the governors of Colorado, Utah, and Nevada began conversations about collaboration on regional electric vehicle corridors. And then on December 19, 2016, the three signed a joint action agreement. That agreement called for them to work together to develop complementary plans for building an electric vehicle charging network across key highway corridors in their states, approximately 2,000 miles of highway, 70, 80, 15, 25, and 76. A work group was created which shared information on how things are moving forward with VW settlement developments in their respective states, studies, corridor station best practices, and current progress in their respective states on the above. A decision to reach out to other Western states to join the collaboration and to develop an MOU was made because it became evident that other states were interested and that it was really a prime opportunity. So the work group members strategized and reached out to other states. Next slide. This resulted in the Regional Electric Vehicle Plan for the West, or REV-WEST, which was signed on October 12, 2017. It included the 8 states of Colorado, Utah, Nevada, Wyoming, New Mexico, Arizona, Idaho, and Montana, and about 7,300 miles of interstate corridors. Its stated purpose is to provide a framework for creating an Intermountain West EV corridor that will make it possible to seamlessly drive an EV across the signatory states' major transportation corridors. It recognizes that EV infrastructure will increase access to states' highways, promote tourism and recreation in our rural communities, and support our economies. And that regional collaboration is a key driver of expanding transportation choices. Next slide, please. The MOU calls for the following activities: creating best practices and procedures that will enhance EV adoption by promoting EV consumer acceptance and awareness by addressing range anxiety, coordinating on EV charging station locations to avoid redundancy and to ensure stations are sited at a frequency and locations so as to optimize utilization and to minimize inconsistencies between charging infrastructure in each state, and leveraging economies of scale. Creating voluntary minimum standards for EV charging stations, including standards for administration, interoperability, operations, and management. Identifying and developing opportunities to incorporate EV charging station infrastructure into planning processes such as building codes, metering policies, and renewable energy generation projects. Encouraging EV manufacturers to stock and market a wide variety of EVs with the MOU states, and collaborating on funding opportunities to support the development of the REV-WEST plan. Next slide, please. The current status of the MOU is that the states have begun to meet via conference call at this point in time. We are exploring solutions for how best to collaborate. We've identified that determining baseline information around the activities for the states is an important first step. The same holds true for creating a summary of best practices. The MOU calls for a progress report on April 1st. Collaboration will continue beyond the state as the states are at the beginning process of this collaboration. Next slide, please. The governor of Colorado took the proactive step of positioning Colorado to begin its planning for EV corridors in executive orders supporting Colorado's clean energy transition. The Colorado Energy Office has taken the lead in partnership with the Colorado Department of Health and Environment, Department of Transportation, and the Regional Air Quality Council in developing a plan which responds to the directive for the state to develop a statewide electric vehicle plan that's going to address building out key charging corridors that will facilitate economic development, boost tourism while reducing harmful air pollution. And stakeholders also saw an opportunity and incorporated goals to also accelerate the adoption of these EVs. So there is a section which goes beyond the original directive. A draft plan was released for comment through the Colorado Electric Vehicle Coalition and other avenues. Largely supportive comments were incorporated, and our plans was approved by the governor in mid-December. We're planning on a release to occur around the end of January, so just the end of this month. We're pretty excited. That's going to happen very shortly. Happy to answer questions at the appropriate time, and now I am going to pass the second half of the presentation to my colleague, Zach Owens, who will talk to you about planning around the RFA for an EV fast charging corridor in our state.
Thank you, Maria. So while Maria covered some of the guiding policies for our work, I'm going to talk about implementation. So the EV plan that's going to come out by the end of this month calls for us to electrify our Tier 1 and Tier 2 corridors. So in Colorado, we came together and nominated Tier 1 and Tier 2 corridor segments for the FAST Act. And 3 of them were selected, but moving forward, we're going to progress with electrifying each of those corridors. And so the first step is looking at scenario mapping and modeling. The National Renewable Energy Lab conducted a study that was released in the middle of last year where they used their BLAST-V tool to model current driving data and also projecting future driving data for fast charging corridors. And so there are about 5 different scenarios that they modeled in this report. Won't go through all of them, but wanted to show a couple here for the sake of example. And a link to the report is here if anyone's interested in potentially doing this in your state and collaborating with NREL. If you could go to the next slide, please. So this is DC FC Scenario 4, which modeled 18 current DC fast charging stations, plus 31 interstate stations, and then 47 highway stations along the Tier 1 and Tier 2 corridors. Scenarios 4 and 5 within this report seem to align nicely with other model projections. We have simultaneously been doing an approach that State of California conducted, which is just modeling every 30 to 50 miles with elevation changes, where approximately would we want to place stations. And so we're taking these mapping scenarios and starting to put approximate cities, towns, locations, and frankly determining the corridors that we want to electrify based on these different modeling scenarios. If you could go to the next slide, please. So this is the second piece that I'm talking about, the graduate students at University of Colorado Boulder. Frankly, a lot of this has been picking up the phone, talking to other states like Washington and California that have done it, and replicating efforts that they've done. And so California told us about how they modeled population centers every 30 to 50 miles, and so the grad students replicated that. So if you could go to the next slide. And so here's where we're starting to see potential local towns and jurisdictions that we would want to place the DC fast chargers along the highway corridors. And so we're starting to better identify approximately where we'd want to see stations every 30 to 50 miles. We're simultaneously overlaying this with utility territories. So Colorado has 3 different types of utilities. We have investor-owned, co-ops, and municipal utilities that all have different rate structures. And so a piece of this, like Tonya mentioned, is collaborating with the utility as we develop this program. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to briefly talk about our current program. We already have a grant program called Charge Ahead Colorado that incentivizes Level 2 and DC fast charging community stations. And we will continue to operate Charge Ahead Colorado in conjunction with electrifying our DC fast charging corridors. And so a piece of this is acknowledging and trying to figure out where the Level 2 makes the most sense within communities. Workplaces and multifamily are really hot topics right now that we're trying to target and pull into the program for Level 2s. And then where does a DC fast charger make sense within communities that may not be right off of the highway? There may be other instances where a DC fast charger makes sense, but it's not exactly off of a highway corridor. And so we want the Charge Ahead Colorado program to supplement our corridor efforts. And more info about this program is on this link here. Happy to chat about that if anyone has questions. Next slide, please. So an overview of our next steps. As I mentioned, we're doing due diligence, looking at scenario mapping. We want to connect with technical experts. We're having conversations with utilities within Colorado, and we want to have conversations with, the industry, equipment manufacturers, and other stakeholders as we develop our request for applications. And so our intention is to release an RFA by the end of Q1, so by the end of March, to electrify our corridors. And so development of the program framework and incentive levels is in process based on the literature review and these conversations. And again, our intention is to release this by the end of this first quarter. So that said, we are interested in speaking with utilities, industry experts, and other interested stakeholders to discuss DC fast charging policy and program development, especially that could inform this RFA. Thank you to the other states that are on this call today that we've already connected with to learn from your efforts, and we want to continue to hear ideas that can inform this RFA process. So my email is here. If you do have information or want to set up a call, happy to have that type of conversation to inform our RFA. Next slide, I think, is the last one. And yeah, here's Maria and my emails. Hit us up on social media, and thanks for your time. Look forward to questions at the end of the webinar.
Great. Thanks so much, Maria and Zach. Really appreciate it. And once again, the slides and the audio are going to be posted on altfueltoolkit.org after this, so you'll be able to access all the slides. Okay, we're going to hear from one more person on a Western State Electric Vehicle Corridor Initiative, and that's James Campbell of Pacific Core. So, James, take it away.
Great, thanks, Jeff. Happy to be here. I'm James Campbell. I'm the Legislative Policy Advisor with Pacific Core. For those of you that don't know about Pacific Core, we're an investor-owned utility. We operate in 6 states, 6 Western states, and we're part of the Berkshire Hathaway Energy family. The 6 states we operate in are California, Oregon, and Washington, although we do business there as Pacific Power. And we also operate in Utah, Idaho, and Wyoming, and there we do business as Rocky Mountain Power. I'm going to focus primarily on the Rocky Mountain Power. That's the side that I work on, although we do have some initiatives in Oregon in our PAC Power. Today's conversation is going to focus primarily on Rocky Mountain Power and what we're doing in the Intermountain West. Next slide, please. So our big initiative at Rocky Mountain Power is what we're calling our West Smart EV program or community partnership. But really what drove that, what started that was in Utah, we had some legislation that set the policy to allow the utility to start operating really with the electric vehicle charging infrastructure. One of the challenges that utilities face is how we do our cost recovery and how our regulators, how our economic regulators allow us to invest capital and make investments in infrastructure, is that we have to demonstrate a ratepayer benefit. So usually before we can invest, we have to show and demonstrate that there's going to be a direct benefit to the ratepayers. One of the challenges with electric vehicle charging is that's a very hard thing to demonstrate. So in Utah, we ran some legislation passed March 2016 that really set the policy to allow the utility to not just make these investments for ratepayer benefit, but to do it as long as there was a public interest. So we set up that policy directive to allow the utility to invest $10 million of our own money, but it really allowed us to start for electric vehicle infrastructure, but it really allowed us to start operating in that space. So once we had that foundational $10 million, we then brought together a lot of the regional experts and created this partnership with Utah State University, the Utah Clean Cities Coalition, the University of Utah, Salt Lake City, Idaho National Laboratory, and Breathe Utah, some NGOs, and there are some other partners as well. But what we did was we got together and said, well, can we do something a little bit more comprehensive? The previous legislation that had the $10 million, that basically what it did was it limited it to really provide incentives over a 5-year period for just the charging infrastructure. But we wanted to be able to do more and a little more comprehensive. So we applied for a Department of Energy award, and we were awarded a $4 million cost share as part of that to do more. And really what we're doing is, as part of the West Smart, we're doing really 6 main tasks. We're developing electric highways, as I'll talk a little bit more in depth. We're also focusing on workplace charging. We're doing a EV fleet deployment program, provide incentives for our customers to really expand their fleets and bring in electric vehicles. We're also working on innovative smart mobility projects on electric buses, electric bikes, and actually we just announced an electric vehicle ride-hailing program with Uber, primarily along the Salt Lake City area. And so most of these, and we're also doing a utility integration analysis, like what are some of the key, how will electric vehicles impact the existing grid? And so, but the ultimate goal of what we're doing, of why, is we want to expand the amount of electric vehicles in the Salt Lake City area in Utah, up to 50,000 vehicles within 10 years. That's kind of what we said, is that through these series of tasks and programs, we can really expand electric vehicles. Now, we picked Salt Lake City because it's the largest metropolitan area in the Intermountain West, and also it's from a transportation, it's kind of a key transportation for the country as well, as the interstates come in. And so we focused on there and then kind of moved out. Although we are going to build the highways, we will expand into Idaho and Wyoming as well, along the Interstate 15 and 80 respectively. Next slide, please. So this map kind of illustrates where we're doing. In this program, it's a 3-year program. So on the highway corridors, we're going to focus again on Interstate 15. What we want to do is be able to go up using Salt Lake City as the focal point, but then be able to go up north into Yellowstone National Park. That eastern Idaho is Rocky Mountain Power Service territory, as well as about 85% of the state of Utah. So which is one unique thing to compare to other states where there's a lot of continuous service territory by just one utility. And then we're also going to, along I-15, go down all the way down to the border with Nevada and our sister utility, which is Nevada Energy, which is part of the Berkshire Hathaway family. We're working with them and ensuring that we have this kind of coordination as well. But then also make sure along Interstate 70 and Interstate 80, as I mentioned before, into Wyoming. But another key component that we're going to make sure is ensure that we have charging corridors out to our national parks. So it's kind of the treasures, and it's one of those things that we're really proud about here in Utah. Next slide, please. So when we started working on these corridors, and okay, well, where do we, pose the question, well, where do we put them? You can kind of simply just look at a map and kind of draw it out. You take a ruler and say how the distance. But we really wanted to do a much more analytical assessment of where the key locations they should be. So we started, again, as I mentioned, we started with Utah as that foundation and Salt Lake City as that focal point. And here's some numbers that reflect the transportation within the state of Utah. There's about 2 million vehicles in the state. 80% of that are along the Wasatch Front or the greater Salt Lake City area. There's about 2.5 million people in the greater Salt Lake City area. Currently, we have about 4,200 electric vehicles. Ironically, before our legislation in 2016 passed, there was only about 2,000 vehicles. So really, since that legislation passed and we've had a lot of awareness, we've doubled the amount of electric vehicles in the community. And so now we're about 10th in terms of market share as a percentage of the total vehicle. So we're growing pretty fast. There's also roughly about 1,100 miles of interstate highways. So again, with major cross-country interstates coming through the state, making sure those corridors are there are pretty critical. And in terms of the state residents and how many people actually and vehicles mile traveled on these interstates and highways, it's significant. It's roughly about 30 billion vehicle miles traveled. So we're kind of using that as our kind of focus. And then, as I mentioned before, we want to make sure there's little spurs out to the national parks, because just at Zion's National Park alone, last year we had 4.3 million visitors, and it's just continuing to grow. And when people go to the national parks, they really want to have a wonderful experience, and getting stuck in traffic with pollution, it really takes away from that. And I've been stuck in traffic in Zion's and MOA or in Arches as well, and it definitely takes away from that experience. Next slide, please. So here kind of shows the market need in Utah. As I mentioned before in this table on the far left, it's about the highway usage in Utah is about 30 billion vehicle miles traveled. And so what we wanted to do was look at, like, okay, how many DC fast chargers are actually needed to support that usage? Then we looked at, okay, what is the actual market share of electric vehicles? At the kind of the lower end of that market share at 0.25%, that will roughly need about 75 fast chargers. And we assumed, again, about a 50 kilowatt fast chargers. Now, that would be the 75 kilowatt chargers throughout the whole state that would be needed to support just 0.25%. Today, before we started, we were at 37. So we were actually quite a bit short of where we needed to be right when we began. And since we've begun, the market share has increased from in that 0.2% to about 0.71% of the market. So really, we're starting to grow quite a bit. And as you see, at 1%, that amount of DC fast charges needed really starts jumping up into the 300 range. And if you want to get to that ultimate goal, where we see it also, one of the big challenges in Utah is from a local air quality standpoint. A lot of our models, we really need to be about 1/3 of our vehicles on the road to be zero emitting to really achieve some of the air quality standards we need to hit. So if we're going to get that point of 30% adoption, we really need, a significant amount of DC fast chargers in place. Also, what we did is we looked at, well, what would some of the electricity needs be and some of the capacity required for that. So even to do 30% market share, we'd only need about 450 megawatts, which we should be able to handle within our current infrastructure. So really, we can do this. We can convert our transportation system over, and it would not put a significant, we can handle that within our existing generation resources. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, when we looked at this, we started doing some modeling, some analysis. So our fundamental goal was, how do we adopt, how do we get to 50,000 vehicles within 10 years? This was part of our proposal. We look at where we were, the blue line is showing where we would be without the corridors and these other programs, and then where we thought we could really jumpstart the EV adoption. But so as we were working on the corridors, we really wanted to start analyzing and develop some models for that adoption of where to put the chargers. And then we also wanted to make sure that it wasn't just going to be the utility. We made a strategic decision. We didn't want these to be Rocky Mountain Power charging stations. We wanted it to be part of the community. We weren't ready to go into the fuel retail business. So what we really, we didn't want to operate, EV gas stations, so to speak. So what we did was we wanted to partner and work with commercial partners who are willing to own and operate, and we would provide some incentives and then work with them to get the infrastructure in place. And so we were looking at, okay, so how can we incentivize the open market on that? And so we started developing some of these optimization models to really do that. Next slide, please. And so this was so we've been working with Utah State University to develop these multi-objective optimization algorithms that really incorporate a lot of that initial traffic data that I was describing, but then also what are some of the energy requirements. And then again, what is the experience that the EV driver wants to have? And so as we're developing these optimization algorithms, we're able to have these three major inputs that go into that. And then we also wanted to make sure that as we develop these models that it was scalable, that we initially were starting with the 50 kilowatt systems, but we wanted to be able to scale it up to the 150 and eventually the 350 kilowatt systems. Next slide, please. And then one of the other things as part of the modeling that we looked at was that, I don't know, it just went dark on me. But anyway, one of the slides that we wanted to look at was what is the effect on the vehicles. So because if you are driving through, let's say, flat desert, that's a little bit different than going through mountainous. So we did some vehicle analysis along these corridors to look at air drag, to look at the air conditioner load, the heating load, stuff like that. And then we also made a strategic decision of what kind of vehicles were we going to model going through these corridors. One of those that we decided was we were not going to build the corridors around the older vehicles like the old Nissan Leafs that were, the 80-mile range. We were going to design these corridors around the next generation vehicles, the 200-mile plus. So we used the Chevy Bolt as kind of that foundational vehicle to run these models. Next slide. There we go. So these are just some of the, if you want to go to the previous slide. Those were just some of the modeling inputs that we looked at, some of the traffic modeling. Then we looked at the performance of the vehicles. And then we created some scoring and weighting to identify these locations, how the accessibility to the national parks, those sort of things. Then now you can go to the next slide. Then what we did was, so we looked at, again, we did this traffic analysis. We looked at where are the vehicles, where are they along the roads. We put in some initial locations along the interstates where we thought, just based on those traffic flows, based on the vehicle performance. Then we overlaid that with some of our grid analysis. We actually had some GIS data, and we overlaid it where our actual transformer, what was the type of power that was available at those locations. Then we created these 4 cost screening scenarios of whether or not it had 480 volt 3-phase, whether or not it was just 208, that sort of thing, that really looked into it, because we wanted to optimize also the cost of putting these systems in place. And this became pretty important because we actually had a location where there was a property owner who was very supportive. They wanted to put some fast chargers in. They were ready to do it, but it was only single-phase power out there. And so it's one of those things, to get 3-phase power would have cost another $500,000 to $1 million just to upgrade that line. And so it just really doesn't make sense to spend that kind of money on those locations. So we found an alternative location to that. And then really, so really to kind of, so after we did this utility infrastructure, we then met with a lot of the market players, some retailers, and talked about what are some of the consumer issues, like, bladder size, that sort of thing. Like, where do consumers want to stop? So again, our initial model had us at one location. And then when we talked to a retailer and said, yeah, why don't let's move it 10 miles south, because people don't want to stop in that town. They do want to stop in the neighboring town. So in summary, what we did was, as part of our corridor, we did a really robust analysis of the traffic patterns. We overlaid that with our utility infrastructure, and then we overlaid that with are really working with our partners on some of the consumer preferences to come up with the key locations. And that's the summary of my presentation, and I look forward to any questions.
Great, thanks, James. That was excellent. So again, this is Jeff Morrison of the Cadmus Group, and I just have a couple quick slides. I wanted to kind of let you guys know about a new resource that it was just launched on Friday, January 20th. It's called the Alternative Fuel Toolkit. It's at altfueltoolkit.org. You can see there at the top of the slide. So this was a joint effort between Oregon Department of Transportation, Federal Highway Administration, and then 9 other state DOTs in a pooled fund. So over the last couple of years, we have been holding workshops around the country. We've been gathering stakeholder ideas about barriers and opportunities with alternative fuel planning. So we're proud to have this new resource out there. The purpose is to help state DOTs, regional planners, and really anyone in the transportation community do alternative fuel planning. So I'm just going to highlight just a couple quick things. There's a lot of things on the site, but I just wanted to give you a little flavor. There's an alternative fuel vehicle cost calculator, which is based on Argonne National Labs A-Fleet model. It takes A-Fleet and it basically creates an online version. It's a little more simple than A-Fleet, so you know, if you really want to get in the weeds, you'll have to download the full Excel model from Argonne's website, but this allows you to do a lot of stuff online, which is great. We also have things like a timeline of alternative fuels going from 1943 to present day in a very interactive way. So if someone's new to kind of alternative fuel planning, you can point them to this, and they can kind of click through some of the resources there and the links and videos and whatnot. We also have things like truck parking and truck stop electrification maps, which are filterable by state or by corridor, by different road type. And so you can kind of do a lot of different things if your state or your region is thinking about electrifying truck stops. You can look at where the current truck parking areas are and sort of match them up with where existing electrification sites are, and do the sort of spatial planning that's needed. So there's a lot more on the website, but I just wanted to point it out that it's there. So again, if you guys have more questions, please put them in the chat box. I have the questions that have been submitted so far. So what I'm going to do is unmute all our speakers right now, and basically I'll just be giving each speaker 1 or 2 questions as time permits. We'll stop at 3:30 Eastern time, looking forward to a good discussion here. So I'll start with Diane since she presented first. Let's see, there's a question: will the MUTCD guidance document be updated, revised in order to help better facilitate placing exit signs along the corridors? More specifically, has FHWA or USDOT ever considered adding a new category of exit signs to appropriately distinguish between level 1, 2, and DC fast chargers along the corridor? Diane?
Yeah, hi, thanks. Let me start with the MUTCD question. I don't really know when the MUTCD is going to be revised or reissued. That's a regulatory action. Obviously it's been a long time since that's happened, and I would have to kind of ask my colleague in Federal Highways Operations Office about that, but I would not anticipate anytime soon. As for the second question, believe me, we have talked about the highway signage and indicating what level of charging it is, what type of charging, but we're just not there yet. That would be probably down, no pun intended, down the road in a phase 3 or 4 that we would get to that level of detail in terms of letting the driving public know from highway signage, what type of EV facility is there.
All right, great. Next question for Tonya. Do you know of any plans for a West Coast hydrogen highway?
Yes, this is Tonya. Really, California is leading on hydrogen right now. The California Fuel Cell Partnership is working on the hydrogen highway. I know there's a lot of support from California's leaders for that. as in the Pacific Northwest, we don't have any public hydrogen highway stations that I know of. It's definitely our state DOT supports all alternative fuels, but it's just a matter of investment. That's a much higher investment than charging stations.
Okay, great. Next question is for Maria and Zach. Do you know to what extent West states are coordinating with Volkswagen's efforts to install a national DC fast charging network over the next 9 years?
Sure, good question. You know, with Electrify America, we are doing our best to keep the lines of communication open. They have generally indicated to us which highway corridors they're targeting in Colorado. And so we're doing our best to try to work in collaboration with them. However, they have not given us exact site locations, and in fact have indicated they likely wouldn't release exact siting locations until they're under contract and ready to go public. So it's a little bit of a dance, to be honest, but we're doing our best to not duplicate efforts. Maria, do you have anything to add to that?
On the Rev West side, as we said, we identified one of our first steps was to figure out where baseline is for all the different states. So we're, looking, on the mitigation side to see, how much is each state getting? Are they going to spend their 15% on EV structure? So we're just compiling that baseline information right now.
Okay, great. Next question is for James. How are stakeholders preparing for the metering and public sale of electricity as a vehicle fuel?
Yeah, so it really depends on the state and what the state allows, because that resale of electricity, would you be considered a public utility? In Utah, we did get a exemption for what's called electric vehicle battery charging services. So if you do that, you're not considered a utility. Now, there's some interpretation of what is an EV battery charging service. So as long as you're not charging per kilowatt hour, but you're charging for the use of it, there's you can do it in Utah, and I believe Idaho adopted the similar language. So it's not so you can do this third-party sale.
Okay, great. We'll go back to Diane. Let's see, I think this is referencing your online maps. So is there a way to consolidate the interactive maps with all the different alternative fuel types with an option to turn legend items on or off depending on need?
I'm going to answer that with the same answer I gave before. We would love to do that. Unfortunately, as I said in the beginning, this program came without funding, and it's just kind of myself working on it, and as I mentioned, Mike Scarpino, a little bit of help from Stephen Costa from Volpe. That would be something we would definitely want to aspire to. I think that would be a great feature to be able to turn off and on fuels in the legend and look at the map all together, but we're just not quite there yet. I'm hoping at some point we'll get some funding to do some of this really cool stuff.
Okay, great. Question for Tonya regarding Tesla. Have there been any opportunities to learn from or collaborate with Tesla based on their supercharging network, e.g. siting, maintenance, working with utilities, etc.?
Yes, absolutely. There are lessons to be learned from Tesla. In fact, I think that a lot of the future stations will be more like Tesla stations, where there will be rows of 6 to 8 chargers, more community depots and highway depots where several vehicles can charge at the same time. And right now, we haven't done any joint projects with Tesla, but we would be very interested in co-locating in the future. We are also working, coordinating with Electrify America on potential highway charging corridors. And I believe that Electrify America is looking at more of that model where there's higher powered stations with more chargers per location.
Okay, great. This is a question that could be answered by any one of the panelists. Are medium and heavy duty EVSE applications featured in any of the programs discussed today, e.g. buses, trucks, intermodal freight hubs, etc.?
Well, this is James from Rocky Mountain Power. Electric buses are a key part of what we're doing, and we actually are partnering with both the local transit authorities and some of the cities who have their own transit authorities. So like, for example, in Park City, Utah, they've put in 6 electric buses to run a shuttle, and we've provided incentives to install some 350 kW chargers for those buses. And part of our long-term plan is to expand those out at key locations. So we are integrating that as part of it. And we're trying to make sure that the utility infrastructure can handle that. But once you've now put that in, to put in additional passenger vehicle chargers kind of on nearby circuits won't be as expensive because you've already built up the infrastructure for it. So we're trying to co-locate.
Great. Anyone else? Medium, heavy duty EVSE applications?
Hey, this is Diane. As far as the corridor program in the EV arena, I mean, we were mostly focused on, light duty vehicles, but obviously in the other fuels, CNG specifically, obviously freight comes to mind, freight movement and freight corridors. But so far with the EV, I think we've been mainly focused on light duty.
Okay. Again, this question I think could be for anyone, but what are the site requirements for 150 to 350 kilowatt DC fast chargers? If anyone knows.
What do you mean site requirements? Like well, you got to have 3-phase power. It's still a 480 volts at least. I think the one difference that you're going to have is some of the you have to have the transformer capacity there, but then you also have to have and you're going to have to do this with all the utilities. You're going to have to do what's called a system impact. So as you're pulling that high of wattage at a given moment, you have to make sure, right, you're not going to cause that neighborhood's lights to flicker everywhere. So it's really going to be site specific. And I think Tonya mentioned this earlier, and I'll echo this. If you're building these out, it's critical to get the utility involved early in the process so they could be able to answer some of those questions. What sorts of impacts will be required?
Okay. Question for Diane. I think, is there FHWA guidance that specifically states that customers who use EV chargers at a park and ride facility, e.g. fringe and corridor parking, can be charged a fee?
Is there specific guidance?
Maybe you can just talk about park and ride EV charging.
Yeah, I mean, basically, let me take a step back here. I mean, I think most folks are aware of the prohibition of Title 23, Section 111 prohibition of commercialization of right-of-way. So you heard Tonya and a lot of folks in California talk about, along interstates, you cannot place and charge. You can place the facility there, but you can't charge for the service. For, you know, if you have an EV charger in the right of way. So that's a prohibition on commercialization. I'm not exactly sure about the park and ride, to be honest with you.
Okay. Question for Tonya. How does your state fund ongoing operations for sites owned and operated by the state?
So let me make it clear that the state doesn't own and operate any of the chargers. We have contracted with grant recipients and, for example, AeroVironment that own and operate the equipment. We're not in that business. Our goal is to be able to provide as much charging as possible. And so our funds have been primarily used to cover the installation of the DC fast chargers, including electrical upgrades and siting and those kinds of things.
Okay. Question for Maria and Zach. How will the Rev West MOU fit in with Diane's National Alternative Fuel Corridor Initiative?
Yeah, not to reiterate myself, but we're still at the beginning of our collaboration phase. I can see from what Diane presented that there's a really good opportunity there for collaboration. I'll definitely bring it back to the group. There's probably some of the group on this call who heard it as well. I think it presents a very good opportunity that the group should look at, but we haven't yet at this time.
Okay. James, do you want to answer that same question? Is there any ongoing collaboration between you and FHWA?
Unfortunately, no, I'd love there to be. I think we have a 3-year project that we're kind of full speed ahead, but I would love to engage. We're working with our state Department of Transportation, but I'd love to engage with the federal, with Diane's group.
Yeah, and this is Diane, and as you kind of looked at in the one map I blew up of the Western states, we do have a lot of signage pending corridors. So, that's an area we can talk to the 7 states on. And as I mentioned before, we'll be holding the convenings. This, to me, would seem one of the prime locations in the country to maybe have representatives from the 7 states and talk about how we get these pending corridors to signage ready. I mean, that's the overlay of coordination and the conversation we'd like to have with you all.
Yeah, and the fact that we'll be not kind of pending anymore, we'll actually be in operation, and so it'd be nice to have this coordination to kind of speed up that communication, because we're pretty close to at least getting our I-15 leg completed.
Right.
Okay, we're almost at time, so maybe we'll do one last question kind of for the group as a whole. What type of advanced planning is being done for inductive charging of autonomous vehicles, or perhaps other solutions for autonomous vehicle charging? Is anyone getting into inductive charging in their corridor efforts?
This is Diane. We held a workshop in inductive charging, had some DOE folks attend up at our Turner Fairbanks Research Center a couple of years ago. And one of the things we were finding is that the technology itself, there has been a lot of research, but one of the other side of the coin is the impacts on the pavement and what maintenance and operations will do to the technology if it's embedded in the roadway. And that's one of the things that I think Federal Highway, and sometime in the near future, may be taking a look at impacts on pavement. But as part of the corridor program, no, we haven't gotten that far.
And this is James, and our partners on our project at Utah State University, who's conducting quite a bit of research on this at the Select Center. I'm glad they're not on the call, because then they would get giddy about talking about induction charging. I think for our project, at least, it's not going to be part of the corridors initially, but there is some opportunities for like bus depot charging, where you have, you know, an overnight type of charging where it can sit for an extended period of time, which is different than actually embedded in the highways.
This is Maria from Colorado. The projects that we just talked about don't have anything currently involving inductive charging. We are aware of research going on within the universities in Colorado, and also our CDOT, our Department of Transportation, is doing a pilot with inductive charging.
Okay. All right. Well, we're at time, so I really appreciate the panelists again for sharing all this information. The slides and the audio recording of this webinar will be available on AltFuel Toolkit within the next day or two. So please check back on that. We'll also be emailing the slides to all registered attendees a little later today. So with that, I will end the slideshow. Thank you very much.